Great. Well, excited to kick off this panel. We've got two amazing speakers here. I guess, Tom, if you wanted to kick off with an intro, and then we can go to Andy.
Well, good evening, everyone. Hope you're finishing your meal. So my name's Tom Oxley. I'm the CEO of Synchron. I'm an interventional neurologist by training. I've been working on Synchron for over 10 years. We've raised 130 million in capital to this point. We're working towards a PMA for a first-in-class of a brain-computer interface. It's an interventional technology, and essentially a brain-computer interface is a technology that helps people who can't use their hands to control digital technologies to improve independence.
And I'm obviously, he's the brains and I'm the brawn up here this evening. I'm Andy Rasdal. I've spent about 35 years in medical devices, starting with one of the first angioplasty companies. And as they were kind enough to reference, I was the first CEO at Dexcom that led through building the team, taking the product to the regulatory piece, taking the company public, and then the first few years of commercialization. Relatively new to BCI, and pleased to be working with Tom.
Yeah, I guess first question, what are BCIs, right? Because it's like a few years ago, no one knew who they were. And then suddenly with like Neuralink and everything, it just exploded onto the scene in the last few years. I guess, Tom, there's just been a lot of myths about what BCI is, right? From, we've got media saying like, are they mind reading technologies or like all this augmentation? I guess, could you tell the audience about what BCI is not, just to set the stage?
Yeah, so I think for this audience, for Medtech audience, so maybe looking at neurotechnology, neuromodulation or neurostimulation has been a big growth area within Medtech. In fact, I saw last year that implantable neurotech, and particularly driven by neurostimulation, had become the biggest backed VC area within Medtech now, overtaking cardiac and orthopedics. So neuro's coming into this kind of heyday, golden period. Brain-computer interface, I think about it as distinct from neuromodulation, but it's in the domain of neuroprosthetics. So it's primarily a sensing technology, an implant that detects brain activity, makes predictions on what the brain is trying to do, and then sends information out of the body to control external devices in a way that's useful for users. And Neuralink, us, and the other brain-computer interface companies are targeting a similar initial application, which is the large unmet need of not just paralysis, but motor impairment. So essentially, people who can't use their hands to control digital devices. So that comes from a range of problems why your body doesn't work, from spinal cord injury to degenerative disease to arthropathies to positive movement disorders like cerebral palsy or Parkinson's disease, where the user is unable to now engage with digital technologies because you have to engage with touching a screen. So BCI promises to take the signal out of the brain, create a new Bluetooth input into a digital device, and then restore digital device technology control. So really the first wave of BCI, well, this wave of BCI is motor BCI, but actually the cochlear device was the first BCI. That was a hearing device. So a neuroprosthesis is a device that restores a brain function, whereas neuromodulation is a device that provides therapy to restore a symptom of a certain type of disease. So.
Cool. Thanks. And Andy, I guess, how did you get involved with Synchron, and how did that all happen?
Yeah, sure. I was fortunate enough to get introduced to Tom, and after a couple conversations on the phone, Tom came to visit me where I live in Park City, and I tell a story that he wanted to go on a hike, and it was late fall, and we started climbing up the side of a mountain. It started to snow, and Tom never lost his passion about sharing the vision for what BCI could do, and so number one, I was attracted to Tom, and since I've met the team, I looked at this as obviously BCI for me unlocks independence for people who otherwise can't live independently at all, and not just for them, but for the millions of people who care for them as well. And when I got to know this is more than just a product, this is a platform technology, I think, that has the potential to visit what I saw happen through cardiology, through balloon angioplasty, through stents, through interventional EP. It can serve as a platform to further unlock the whole neuro arena.
And kind of where I'm sitting, I see a lot of similarities in terms of, obviously, Andy, from your experience, right? Just bringing a completely new technology with Dexcom, as former CEO, taking the company through a successful IPO to recently I read, I think that it's wild. It hit like over $1 billion or something like in sales, right? So how on earth did you actually do that? It's almost like, you're creating a completely new market, which is exactly what Synchron and these other BCI companies are trying to do here. Like, can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, everything always looks so linear and romantic. And I can tell you when I started that journey, I was 6'4", and so no matter how you do it, it takes its toll. But the truth is, it's building a great team that has a common, unified vision and keep solely focused on that. That's the most important thing, are the people, and that's what attracted me to Tom and Synchron. The next most important piece is you actually have to deliver on something that works, and having a really strong foundation of a technology, because anybody who knows the Dexcom journey knows that the first product, which was approved in 2006, wasn't adequate to grow the market to what it is today. But having a fundamentally strong platform allowed that technology to evolve into more usable products until today. It's a standalone substitute to manage blood glucose. And so at that point, it became a very large market opportunity, good people, which included very strong and knowledgeable investors, and then navigating the path.
Thanks. And that brings me to, my next question, which is on funding, right? Like, how do you convince investors? I know, like, all the attendees right here, everything, ton of panels on funding, VC, the current environment, right? How is that process like from, Synchron has been, 10 years in the making, right? What was that funding kind of, I read online that you literally cold called DARPA, right, for funding. Walk us through that.
Well, the funding journey, I guess, 10 years ago, brain-computer interface was a science fiction story. I think so I was doing neurology, and I was watching the advent of interventional neurology take off in neuro. Well, not take off, it was just very early stage. So interventional neurology history was starting with coils, and then over the last 5 years, stroke therapy has started to explode now. But the origin story for Synchron, I co-founded it with Rahul Sharma, who's the head of the Stanford Cath Lab, interventional cardiologist. And the thesis for Synchron was, if interventional cardiology could lead to such an explosion of technologies, not just in the mechanical domain, but in the electrical domain, electrophysiology, mapping, ablation, pacing, defibrillation, resynchronization, well, the brain is a much bigger electrical organ than the heart. So surely it seemed to me obvious that technology will eventually migrate from the heart over to the brain, in which case we're going to see a renaissance revolution of interventional approaches into the brain. So that idea was in my head, and then brain-computer interfaces were starting to emerge. The first human clinical report was back in 2006 with the BrainGate system. So BCI was in the academic domain for 20 years, and so our approach was, we'll take an interventional approach to solving that. And now, the fundraising story has been initially starting with the solution for brain-computer interface. Now there are several companies chasing brain-computer interface, but the ambition for Synchron is growing because we have an intellectual property position, which is interventional implantable neurotechnology. And I think as neurotechnology is now exploding, and the investment is incredible, especially in neurostimulation, but we have a true platform opportunity because the blood vessels get to all areas within the brain. We've built a full vertical stack platform of technology that can sense or stimulate through the blood vessels, and we're now picking off the areas that we think could be the start of multiple products, starting with brain-computer interface. And long-winded way to get to your question, but it started out with, so we had a technique, we had a surgical approach, we had an intellectual property, and then we had a first product opportunity. And as BCI was getting a lot of excitement, we could attract initial grants, and then it wasn't until I moved to the US. I don't know. I think for this audience, it's interesting because we haven't had traditional medtech investors, and there are other ways to secure funding than just traditional medtech. And I think I've got to say, like, traditional medtech approach is quite a little bit rigid in its thinking. There's very clear views on how a device should be valued at exit, what your acquisition strategies are. IPOs in medtech are unusual, so having an IPO strategy or vision is not always kind of like, thought to be very high risk. But there are different ways to go about it, and I think you've got to identify what you're doing differently, what the market opportunity is, and then just do bit by bit. But the vision's got to expand as you go.
And now I think the company's raised over $100 million in funding, and with the latest round being a $75 million Series C round, I believe 2022, is that right? Led by Arch Ventures, even with participation from, some pretty heavy hitters like Bill Gates and also Jeff Bezos. Like, how did you attract, that level of, from Bill Gates and
That's what
Jeff
we used to hope to
Bezos,
raise
right?
in an IPO, right? Let alone in a Series B or a C.
I think telling the story to different investor bases. So there's a biotech story with what we're doing. So our last investor is more of a biotech, but there's this data-enabled biotech is your product infused with AI, and what does that mean, and what does that mean for potential future growth? The tech story is, how does your technology converge with consumer technology? And for us, we're using iPads to prove that our technology works. That's what it looks like. It's a medical device that controls an iPad. So there's Zuckerberg talking about a neural interface being the holy grail of technology control. So there are technology sort of narratives and stories to run with that deliver technology investors into the round. And then but we're a medtech company with the same reimbursement and regulatory risks that we have to burn down. So I think, different audiences, slightly different talk tracks, and different groups giving different valuations for where things might go, and just selling the story of where this will go in the future.
So, and Andy, I think we were having this conversation earlier. I know there's an IPO panel tomorrow at LSI, but how was that process in terms of taking Dexcom through to a successful public listing?
Well, I think it was certainly controversial because we proposed taking Dexcom public in 2005. This was pre-FDA approval, obviously pre any kind of commercialization or revenue, with a device in a category that had never been approved by the FDA before. And again, it really came down to a strong group of people. I had the fortune of I think building a very strong board of directors. With some people who'd been through not only medical technology, but very high-level technology as advisors. We built a good syndicate of advisors with our legal teams, the underwriting team. And then we had very, very strong, I think, data and a compelling story to get get the company out early. And it was a struggle, no doubt, but we did have a successful IPO and raised a lot of money.
So why is it that there are so many less medtech IPOs than biotech IPOs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always almost look at the biotech IPO as being like what we would do in a Series C or a Series D, but it's a very different model, I think, than the medtech. And I've said this publicly a number of times over the many, many years that I think a lot of medtech entrepreneurs and CEOs, maybe we just wear out and we take the early exit. And we take $2 or $3 or $4 or $500 million for a company, rather than take the risk of having to go public, having to build commercial success, having to build cash flow and revenue growth, and ultimately showing that you're cash flow independent, which is why the values like Dexcom happen. If we sold Dexcom, after the Series D in the category, it would have been one price, but look at the value it's created. But not easy, no question.
So Dexcom went public. You didn't secure reimbursement. Well, Dexcom didn't secure reimbursement for 7 years after they IPO'd, and the stock price was, not languishing, but it was at a certain level. But if you look back now, we've talked about, and I think it's interesting to share the what was the benefit of getting the PMA early and doing the IPO early that you think contributed to Dexcom's success later, and in terms of beating Abbott, or what were the important things that gave Dexcom the edge about taking that decision to go out early?
Yeah, it always looks so much easier in retrospect when you try to explain it. But again, I just can't say enough about the fundamental foundation of the technology. This was a real strong platform of a technology. The decision to go public was difficult and it was controversial, but it accomplished a couple things. It got us a large amount of capital to continue to build the organization at a reasonable cost. And it put all classes of stock into the same level. There was no preferred, there was only common stock. And so besides having an aligned management team, you now had an aligned investment team to be able to go pursue the next step. We were fortunate enough to leapfrog the two other competitors in the market in the regulatory process by years with a regulatory strategy that allowed that. I think we got credit for that. We did a follow-on offering upon FDA approval that was just a little over 100% of the IPO price. We more than doubled. And so I think we picked up some momentum along the way. But it gained us funds, it gained us independence, and I think more importantly, it gained us alignment between the investors and the investors on the board, the management team, and the ability to go forward.
One thing that we've spoken about is heading towards a PMA. So we're viewing if Synchron can get to a first-in-class PMA in brain-computer interface, we think that could be a big value generator for the company. So we're making decisions on how can we get to PMA as quickly as possible in our company. If you look back at Dexcom, what were some of the decisions you made around getting to PMA quickly that, say, Abbott, compared to Abbott, who you were racing with to get first-in-class approval? What were those decisions and why were they important?
Yeah. So Dexcom, when it started Dexcom, it was a fully implantable 1-year device intended to measure glucose like that. And along the way, we figured out that due to human biology and the foreign body response, that it was unlikely we would have a 1-year implantable device to measure glucose in my lifetime. And we made a decision to switch. And from the time we switched to a fully implantable to a subcutaneous, again, back to the technology platform, we were into humans successfully within 4 months of the time. So we had a good platform that enabled us to move very quickly and a good team to move forward with that. And it put us in a position from a technology standpoint of being first. The decision to then enter the regulatory arena, this was a category that had never been approved by the FDA. And the concern with them was people are going to use this new device to measure their blood glucose levels and misadminister insulin. And if you take too much insulin, the result is dire at best. And so in moving the FDA along through a number of discussions with very strong data, ultimately from a randomized crossover study design, we decided to pursue what was called an adjunctive claim for the first continuous glucose monitor that patients could use, meaning that they could use it for the information, but the labeling said before you administer glucose, you should confirm with a finger stick. And I think what that enabled us to do is build a lot of strong trust and credibility with the agency. And so we literally moved through years ahead of time. And once you're first, then you get to set the parameters of competition as well as the regulatory processes for everybody who follow behind you.
How do you set the parameters?
Well, when you have a best-in-class performing device with a strong foundation, in this case, you show accuracy, reliability. Our display was novel. It was the first time patients had been able to see an actual graph of their glucose. You know, interestingly enough, if I'm sure there's people here that have diabetes, you know, your glucose isn't changing like this. It's like the world's slowest game of Pong, as we used to describe it, but nonetheless, it goes up and down. And to visually, so we had a visual display that didn't just give people a number, because what does a number matter? If your blood glucose is 130 mgs per DL, that's great information. If it's going up at a great rate, for goodness sakes, take insulin to bring it down. But what happens if it's 130 and it's on a sharp decline and you give insulin? Then you end up with hypoglycemia. So we were able to set the standard for reliability, accuracy, and then how that information was conveyed to patients that I think is carried through to this day for Dexcom.
So we had, the reason I was chasing Andy to join our board was because I saw a lot of
Because you could catch me.
a lot of similarities between brain-computer interface and continuous glucose monitoring, sensing technology, lifestyle modification, digital enablement, digital app required to engage with the technology. First, like new product, new technology, and no obvious reimbursement pathway. So a lot of these things, and then chasing a PMA and, you know, having to go down the IPO road. So a lot of similarities for Synchron.
And talking about kind of the user experience, Andy, like we didn't even talk about this yet, but Tom, in terms of just how simple Synchron's BCI or Stentrode, can you talk a bit about just the product design and kind of the thought that went into that? Because I think one key difference between what you've built and what Neuralink and some of these other BCI companies is really going through the endovascular approach, or you know, going through the natural highways of the brain, right? Your blood vessels.
Yeah, so the challenge for brain-computer interface is that you have to get close to the motor cortex. And traditionally that would require a craniotomy, and that's what the traditional approach to BCI has been: cut open the skull, get to either the surface of the brain or penetrate into the brain, and they both come with challenges. But I think our technology looks a lot like a cardiac pacemaker. It sits in a vein. It's got a stent attached to a lead. It gets engulfed or, you know, enveloped into the wall of the blood vessel, and it detects through sensing local voltage changes in, you know, the remote region. So and then it comes down into the chest, and it's got what looks like a traditional pacemaker in the chest. So we've actually leveraged a lot of the technology from pacemakers, from stents, from neurostimulators or pacemakers, and put it all together. In totality, it's a completely novel device, but in its modularity, it's got a lot of predicates, which makes our journey through regulatory and reimbursement more navigable, with lots of predicates that we can discuss. And I think that's been very important for the FDA, because we can leverage the safety profile that's known for stents and leads for a long time.
Right. And you've implanted 10 patients in total right now with your BCI device. And I guess in terms of where you are in the clinic right now, in clinical trials, you know, you're the leading company kind of literally with your early feasibility study, the COMMAND study, that's ongoing in 3 clinical sites in the United States right now. Can you tell us a bit about just what's next for Synchron and just where you are with this?
Yeah, so we've moved through a first in human in Australia. Then we did an early feasibility study in the US. That's finishing. We've completed enrollment. We're getting towards the last follow-up for our 6th patient. So it's 10 patients in total now. The FDA there's been a great conversation with the FDA about what a pathway through to approval looks like, and that conversation is continuing to happen. And we're now, so we've taken that data set, and we're now, and we, you know, the manufacture for that system was at a certain level, but we're now getting ready for commercial scale manufacture. So we're moving through completion of manufacturing design, we're moving into characterization, and then validation will happen over the next few months. And then we'll prepare for a later stage clinical trial with our eyes set on getting a PMA for a brain-computer interface for motor impairment.
And we found it, Tom, we found it so important that when you're having those first conversations with the FDA, if you can set the requirements for safety and efficacy endpoints, and then you can deliver on that data and set threshold, it just makes those following behind you have to achieve at least what you have achieved, moving forward with that. Probably many people in the audience have gone through developing a device to your first, animal work, and you go to your first human use, and always laugh that, when you finally go to humans, you learn what the device really does and doesn't do, and that's the first few humans. When you go to 10 or 20 or 30 humans, then you actually learn how people use the device, and again, the ability of the team to be able to iterate through that and rapidly change and improve it is important, and again, the advantage of being first.
If anyone knows what thrombectomy is, I'd say the biggest advance in stroke medicine ever, actually. And it basically involves putting a catheter up into the brain, grabbing onto a blood clot that's causing an occlusion that leads to a stroke, and pulling out the blood clot, restoring blood flow. 2015, 5 New England Journal papers, overwhelming efficacy, number needed to treat of 3 to get patients with major stroke back home and independent, compared to like PCI for coronary intervention, number needed to treat of 26. So huge impact. What that's done is led to a massive increase in neurointerventional resource allocation from local level, like down to community level hospitals. So if you have a stroke, it's likely that the ambulance will take you down to a secondary level hospital, and there'll be an interventionalist there on 24/7 call, ready to pull that blood clot out. So that's led to this maturing of interventional neurology. And so the question now is, what technology can we deliver? But as it pertains to endpoints, so what happened with stroke was, when the first technology came through, the way that stroke is now being assessed is using clinical outcomes, modified Rankin scale for levels of independence. But when the first device came through to show that they could pull out blood clots, the first pivotal trial, it just had to prove that the device itself could pull out the blood clot. And the independent stuff was going to come, but the FDA recognized that, well, the first thing we have to do is to prove that the devices work and that you can restore blood flow. What they didn't know at the time was that you have to restore the blood flow ideally within 6 hours. And if you do it at 48 hours, you're probably not going to help that patient, even though you've restored the blood flow. It's an interesting predicate, because as a new technology comes to market, the discussion over clinical endpoints with the FDA initially starts with, does the device perform as it's intended to perform, and can you have clinical outcomes around that? And then it's like, how do you measure the broader patient health outcome? Because it's not obvious initially. For brain-computer interface, how do we measure how you control your iPhone or how you control your iPad? There's no tool to assess how well you text, or how well you email, or what your level of function is, and then how much of a drop-off do you have in your capacity to control your iPhone after a stroke? And then can a BCI restore that level up to a certain function? So we don't know, and we have to develop all these tools. So we're having really interesting conversations with FDA now. I think we'll look back in 10 or 15 years and it'll be more obvious. But smartphones have crept up on us over about a 15-year period, and we take them all for granted. But as soon as you lose your ability to control one, you want that back. So figuring out clinical outcome tools to determine clinical efficacy is not an obvious thing right now.
With thrombectomy, Tom, how much of that has the growth in that's been driven by the evolution of technology, making it easier, safer, faster? Has there been, so when we went through this, the first angioplasty balloons were about that big. There was 2 guiding catheters shaped, and if you put it in there for longer than 5 minutes, it had no support. And so, the Jeffrey Hartzers, the Simon Sturzer, the Richard Meilers could do angioplasty, but the people in non-tertiary hospitals didn't have a chance. As guiding catheter technology became braided, as balloons became increasingly miniaturized and smaller, and then the advent of stents is where people in the community hospital, do you see a similar path through the neuro, where it's a few people can do it and eventually technology enables everybody?
So in 2010 to 2013, that was the situation. There were some physicians who could get the catheter up, grab the blood clot, and get it out, even though there weren't perfect tools created for that. And those physicians knew that if you did it quickly the right way, the patients come in unable to talk, hemiplegic, destined for a nursing home. You get out the blood clot, and they wake up like a zombie rising up, and it's unbelievable when you see it. But then the evidence was murky because some couldn't do it and some could. And then Medtronic made the acquisition of EV3, which was from Chestnut, and they had this device that could grab onto the clot really well. And then the success rates shot up, and then the number needed to treat suddenly was very high. And now, so initially it was this stent type approach, and then the catheters themselves, like a vacuum cleaner attached to a pump, where the breakthrough had to be in flexibility of catheters with a wide bore that didn't kink. Yeah. And so that's been the huge breakthrough in catheters now. So now we have really awesome access technology that can get to any region in the brain. And so what our vision has been, okay, now we can get anywhere. How do we now engage with brain tissue through the wall? Because you've got this huge electrical organ, and taking lessons from cardiac EP, now bringing it into interventional neurotechnology.
Yeah, it was interesting. Going through that whole, I mean, again, while I was so attracted to Synchron is, much of my career was watching CABG, open heart surgery, transition to balloons and then stents, surgical ablation to catheter-based ablation, in the fact that Synchron doesn't require a craniotomy that we access through the vessels in the natural passageway. Seems to be a stronger platform.
Yeah, and so I think it was Grunsig, Andreas Grunsig in 1980.
First angioplasty, yeah.
He locked himself in the basement. I think he was in Atlanta. In Emory. He was at Emory, locked himself in the basement of the hospital, put a catheter into his own heart, blew up a balloon, and did it awake with a nurse there helping him catheterize himself, and then went up to the Christmas party and announced that he'd just done this. And then the word got around that, you can plasty inside the heart and it doesn't kill the patient. So then plastying took off, and then stents, and then pacemakers, and there's this huge explosion. And I'm looking at neuro right now. You've got DBS for epilepsy, for Parkinson's. You've got stereotactic EEG for ablation. You've got monitoring systems and now brain-computer interface. Great proof points if you do it through craniotomy that it can be very effective. But, lots of challenges with scaling into market, because there's same with cardiothoracic surgery, there's not many centers that can perform open brain surgery. And so I think, we're at the cusp of this moment in neurotechnology where catheter-based therapies are now becoming available, and this explosion of technologies, but the convergence of neurovascular with neuromodulation and now neuroprosthetics. I think intervention's going to be a huge explosion now. The infrastructure's ready, the infrastructure's been primed through thrombectomy, but there's so much that can be done because of the electrical side of the brain.
Yeah, I think when technology innovation coincides in the right way with clinical innovation, we see these high growth markets, PTCA stents, neuromod, some of these as well.
And I think that's another unique differentiation with Synchron and the Stentrode, right? Where you don't need to take out, a chunk of your skull, and you don't need, you're not basically going through neurosurgeons, you're going through cath labs. So what's your vision, Tom, in terms of scaling BCI? Like what does the industry still need to do, to enable this?
It's not even that you don't need the craniotomy. It's that even if that was easy and safe and cheap, it's that you can't do more than tens of thousands of procedures a year because of the limitation on infrastructure of academic neurosurgical centers. I think there's about 150 places in the US where you can go and have a skull cut open and have technology put into your brain, but there's 10 times that neurointerventional labs now that with these physicians who are learn how to do stroke therapy, and they're on 24/7, but they don't have enough to do during the day. So there's actually oversupply of infrastructure and demand, like a look for demand for interventional technologies, and oversupply of the workforce now because they have to meet 24/7 coverage mandated by government now because it's good for for the economy. So yeah, I think if we can deliver technology that works through catheters, scale is built in. It's just a matter of proving that it works well enough.
Miss Andy, if you could redo anything from your Dexcom days, what would you redo? And I guess now that you're
Get a different CEO.
now that you're kind of on the board at Synchron, like what are you telling Tom in terms of what to avoid basically as he's building?
I think the biggest piece was fail fast, and so I'd say fail faster. Make sure you don't make a decision before you have to make a decision. But when it's time to make a decision, for goodness sakes, make the decision, because you need to find out if you're 100% right, 90%, 80% right, and then be able to flexibly and rapidly adjust the direction. We've had a couple good companies, AVE, which is one of the first coronary stent companies. We took it public, sold it to Medtronic for $4.3 billion back in 1999. And we started as a low-cost angioplasty balloon headed for Japan, and ultimately are successful. At Dexcom, we started as a fully implantable one-year glucose monitor and went to a 3-day patient-delivered subcutaneous. And so I think it's fail fast, which we did, earn your lessons. Realize as a CEO, you're either raising money or spending money, and the more successful you are, the more time you get to spend raising money.
I guess Tom, in terms of where Synchron is today, what would you say is like the key technical challenge that you had to overcome to actually make this product a reality right now?
I think so. We have a mechanical device, we have a telecommunications component, we have a AI component of prediction of analytics, and then we have a digital component for consumer interaction. I think putting it all together and building a company, building a leadership team, you tend to gravitate towards certain types of focus. And we really focused on Medtech and PMA approval, but that, so I think managing the areas of like AI and digital doesn't always go with mechanical and PMA. So I think identifying where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses and how can we build a team that can execute on all of that, being really pragmatic on manufacturing and design decisions that would give us a break, like just try and simplify things as much as possible. For example, the lead in our system, we've just borrowed from a cardiac defibrillator lead that is able to, we didn't want to reinvent the lead, and the way the head stage works in the mechanical component, the stent components, we wanted to try and simplify as much as possible, and then focus on our strengths.
And I also saw that recently you acquired a stake in Aquandis. From a manufacturing standpoint, I guess how far in advance should companies be thinking about manufacturing and kind of controlling the logistics and the supply and everything, the supply chain?
Yeah, so a stent is usually a tube that's laser cut into whatever shape you want. We have a circuit, active electrical circuit printed onto a self-expanding nitinol stent. So we had to figure out how to build a nitinol stent, put a layer of insulation on it, and we have a ceramic layer, and then on top of that, build an electronic circuit. So we had to do a completely novel manufacturing process using a sputtering technology. And so we've made a investment in a partner to shore up that manufacturing line. We wouldn't have. I think identifying. I think what's important is you have to identify where your intellectual property and know how specialization is if you're building a complex system, and then leveraging other problems that have been solved. Don't reinvent the wheel, and focus on your strength and your IP and building around that.
I'm going to ask this question, even though you guys don't want me to. Reimbursement, the dirty word. So, what's the strategy there right now in terms of reimbursement, in terms of bringing a completely novel device that has never been approved before?
So it's going to be a journey. The good thing about, well, we've specifically designed our system to be able to target reimbursement codes that are pre-existing. So for example, cardiac pacemaker or a neurostimulator that sits in the chest that does either receiving or stimulating, there are codes that exist for that. So, and then, the brain component, and then the software piece is a bit tricky. I think Medicare and CMS have not traditionally reimbursed digital or software components of systems, certainly not in an ongoing way. So you're looking for reimbursement up front. But we've made design decisions that mean that even though it's a new product, we can isolate components of our system and point to predicate reimbursement items. So we've got breakthrough device designation. The TSET program that is in front of Congress right now, well, is it TSET? I can't remember. It keeps changing, but it wasn't, we were excited about breakthrough and our investors were excited about breakthrough, but it's not totally obvious to me that TSET and breakthrough is going to be a slam dunk. There's a bunch of reasons why it wouldn't be. So even for breakthrough devices, I would recommend that you're looking for avenues of more traditional reimbursement that point to predicates, and be very aware of the design decisions you make should have multiple shots on goal for reimbursement.
And I mean, coming in from the outside, Tom, I guess I was impressed with a couple of other things. One is you've already got a team, and you've already started very early in the reimbursement process. The other that was always very compelling for us is we went through this with Dexcom. The power of JDRF as a patient advocacy group was just so broad. It's just, I think it's the most successful influence group in the world today. But the patients that you're going to treat initially have very, very difficult lives. And just as importantly, all the people who care for them also have difficult lives without the level of independence. And I think you've already begun to reach out and to harness, and it's not hard to do, the patient advocacy groups there as well. And so I think starting early, patient advocacy, designing the device to take advantage of codes, and ultimately beginning to deliver on very meaningful outcomes data that gives people independence will accelerate that. And there is no substitute. Our challenge was there was still finger sticks. People wanted continuous, but those were the patients. Payers didn't want it. And so the burden was a bit higher than I think we'll have at Synchron.
And Tom, I guess right now, in terms of patients in the clinical trial, not just patients with ALS, but potentially BCI could be for patients that, have lost mobility through stroke. And I guess, what are the other future applications for BCI that you see?
So the FDA are contemplating BCI as synonymous with neuroprosthesis, as distinct from neuromodulation. Neuroprosthesis is a medical device that restores a brain function. So brain function, hearing, seeing, smelling, thinking, planning, feeling. So I think motor BCI is about movement control, and that's relevant. It's critically relevant because so much of brain function is around processing or experiencing. I mean, sensory hearing is all input. There's not that much of an output from the brain. So if you think about it, your ability to express your internal state is actually totally dependent on your motor system carrying fibers out of your brain to express your inner state. I'm using the muscles of my mouth to explain, I'm gesticulating. So in a way, the output function of the brain, the motor system is in a way the most impactful loss of brain function because you are not able to express yourself. So I think that's what seems to be all the BCI companies are initially targeting. But I know Neuralink has talked about vision next, and there's obviously been a couple of companies that have attempted visual prostheses, yet to sort of break through with a big therapeutic impact. Cochlear is a neuroprosthesis hearing device. I know there's a company here that is doing a memory prosthesis attempt. Nia, Dan is here somewhere. But I think, yeah, so there's neuroprosthetics, and then I think interventional will also be an avenue to solve neurostimulation, neuromodulation. We'll be able to provide deep brain stimulation options that don't require craniotomy. And then I think there's going to be a whole product line of neuromonitoring, predictive forecasting type devices that with a permanent implant, collecting data over a brain state in certain conditions where predictions of brain states can have a huge impact on lifestyle. Epilepsy as an interesting example.
Yeah, I think Tom probably shoot me, but the idea of being able to non-surgically place a sensor in close proximity to different areas of the brain unlocks so many things. As Tom knows, I live with epilepsy every day in my household. And the impact of improving the quality of life somebody that has severe epilepsy, just by being able to sense, predict, maybe even treat, opens up for, there's we look at the value we created with Dexcom with 2 million type 1 diabetics. There's double that amount of people diagnosed with epilepsy in the US today. So there's these disease states that are just gigantic, that are currently untreated, except with meds, and the ability to place a sensor unlocks the understanding and the treatment of those diseases.
And I guess, would you say that, I mean, since you went through like the whole, Dexcom, CGM, like where do you see BCI right now as a field and as an industry? Would you say that, we're kind of in the beginning, in the middle, like heading towards, where are we right now?
I think for me to place it temporal is difficult right now. I think we're earlier, but the enthusiasm, the momentum for BCI has captured people's imagination in a way that CGM didn't, right? Continuous glucose only captured, what really captured the minds are parents of kids with diabetes who are tired of the fear of hypo, and then adults who are trying to manage their disease. It captured their minds, but that's 1 million, 2 million people. If you watch what goes on with BCI today, it's captured the imagination far beyond that, and so the momentum and the interest, I think, is going to accelerate it faster than we saw.
I think it's been hard for people to understand what BCI is. What I've noticed with our patients is it's hard to imagine what it would be like to lose your ability to move. And what happens when you become paralyzed is you lose your agency in the world. You become dependent on someone else. You lose your privacy. You lose your autonomy. You lose this kind of thing that you take for granted, which is your ability to physically enact your will, like your volition. And the feeling that, I mean, we're still very early, so the system that's working right now the patients can move a cursor around a screen and make selections and navigate their way. We're using iPhone. It's not nearly as fast as what you or I could do with our fingers, but the feeling the patients get when they can make a selection on a screen independently is very powerful. And I think, there's been a big consumer kind of public perception of what BCI is and, a science fiction overlay of a dystopic outcome here. But the reality is this is for people who have what has traditionally been considered in medicine an untreatable condition. Once the nerves are damaged, that's it. And I started neurology and I loved the brain, but I quickly realized in medicine, we're like the neurologists to the butt of all the jokes. Orthopedic surgeon, why would you do neurology? You can't fix anything. Or you have to do radiology or dermatology or orthopedics, because neurology is, you can treat everything but fix nothing. And BCI and neurotechnology is now coming up with ways to restore function that was previously considered impossible. And in terms of the patient numbers, we're looking at numbers. It's the number of people who, stroke is a big thing, but then you add in things like ALS, multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury, severe arthropathies, peripheral nerve disease, brain injury, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's disease, movement disorders. The list is very long. And the technology doesn't solve any of these conditions. It's like a bypass from your brain to digital devices that restore your agency. So I think BCI is going to be massive. I think it could become one of the largest areas within all of medtech.
No, I know we're getting close to the end of this panel with a few minutes left, but do you think that, within my lifetime that, able-bodied people would, walk in similar to a LASIK center or something, get a BCI installed, and if that's the future? I mean, right now I completely understand it's for medical use only, but I mean, in, I don't know, few decades, 50 years time, something like that.
I think the human body, more is happening in your brain than what you can collect with your mouth, express with your words, or do with your fingers. You're definitely, if you've ever felt like you want to text faster than what you can text, like there is a limit on what our body can do. Do I think within 20 years BCI gets more sophisticated than what the human body can do in terms of digital interactions? I think that's not crazy. I think it's pretty probably plausible and likely. And it's hard to imagine now, looking at how technology is developing, what we're going to be doing or what our children will be doing in 20 years with technology, or what that will look like. And will your hands be able to do that? I mean, I think, so there's going to be a Moore's law with brain-computer interfaces. If you can continue to get access to more brain cells in a way which is sustainable and safe, and it's a procedure that's at the level of a pacemaker, and the technology can do more than what your hands can do, then yeah, you can see there could be an interesting future of this. But it's 20 or 30 years away probably.
Because you never know, right? Like Andy, when you first started Dexcom, like did you ever think that the company to grow to like over $1 billion in revenues with like, I don't even know, like millions of people using CGMs right now?
Again, it's always easy in retrospect, but absolutely not. Never envisioned it would become as important as it has become for people living with diabetes, expanding beyond that, and to create the value it has created for all constituencies would have been beyond my wildest dreams.
So you never know, Tom. We don't know. We just don't. I mean, the future's out there, right? So great. Well, any closing comments before we wrap up this panel? I know, maybe we could grab a drink after this panel together. It's kind of chilly
I'm
out
the
here.
brawn.
I'm
I'll
glad
defer
I
to the
brought
brains.
a jacket. So.
Thank you for coming, Andy.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you, Tom.
Andy. Thanks, Tom.
Cheers.
Appreciate it. Thank you.